Predator becomes prey in the Florida Everglades as hundreds of hunters descend on the Sunshine State to catch and kill as many Burmese pythons as possible.
Most invasions follow a pattern. Something arrives, it spreads. People notice too late. The damage becomes the new normal. The Florida Everglades followed that pattern perfectly, but then something changed. The cameras kept rolling. And what they started capturing inside those swamps was something none of the scientists had predicted. Something their models had not accounted for, and something that reframes the entire story of what is happening in one of America's most critical ecosystems. How paradise became a graveyard. Before we talk about what the trail cameras have been revealing, we need to understand the scale of what the Everglades has been living through. Because the numbers are not the most haunting part. The most haunting part is the silence. On August 24, 1992, Hurricane Andrew made landfall south of Miami with sustained winds of 165 miles per hour.
Only a painful experience. This sand is hitting us so hard that it feels like BBs hitting your skin.
65 people died, $27 billion in damage. It remains one of the most destructive storms in American history. And somewhere in the chaos of that night, a reptile breeding facility near the Everglades collapsed. Its enclosures failed. An unknown number of large tropical constrictors slipped into the floodwater and into the wetland beyond it and were never recovered. Nobody went looking for them. There were 65 people to bury and $27 billion in wreckage to deal with. The pythons could wait. The pythons used that time well. At the same time, across South Florida, a different problem was compounding. Tens of thousands of exotic pet owners had made a decision. They had purchased Burmese pythons as hatchlings, small and manageable, without understanding what they were buying. A Burmese python does not stay small. It reaches 12 feet in a suburban living room and it keeps going. The solution, for far too many owners, was to drive to the edge of the Everglades and open the car door. They thought they were setting the animal free. They were pointing a loaded weapon at one of the most biodiverse wetland systems on the planet. The Everglades is over 1.5 million acres of subtropical wetland with year-round heat, humidity, and a food supply so abundant and so completely unprepared that it functioned as an all-you-can-eat buffet with no closing time. The native wildlife had spent thousands of years evolving alongside their actual predators: alligators, bobcats, Florida panthers. A Burmese python was not in that pattern library. A raccoon in the Everglades had never encountered an ambush predator that could reach 15 feet, detect body heat in total darkness, lie motionless in 2 inches of water for hours, and strike faster than the eye could follow. The raccoon walked past the coiled python the way you walk past a garden hose. Dr. Frank Mazzotti, a wildlife ecology professor at the University of Florida, described it in terms that stayed with every researcher who heard them. He said releasing Burmese pythons into the Everglades was like releasing wolves into a petting zoo. The pythons did not just survive, they consumed. A female Burmese python lays between 50 and 100 eggs per clutch and incubates them with the commitment of a brooding bird. No native predator had evolved a strategy to deal with them. The population went vertical. Conservative estimates today put Burmese pythons in South Florida at 100,000. Higher estimates reach 300,000. 300,000 apex predators inside an ecosystem that had none of them 30 years ago. Mazzotti published the landmark study documenting what that meant in practice. Raccoons down 99.3%, not 10, not 50, 99.3. From ubiquitous to functionally absent. Opossums crashed 98.9%. Bobcats fell 87%. Marsh rabbits and cottontail rabbits are now considered locally extinct across most areas of successful python invasion. Species after species not reduced but collapsed. But the numbers are still not the most haunting part. The most haunting part is what Dr. Mazzotti described when he drove the roads through the Everglades that he had driven for 30 years. Roads where in the 1980s you could not travel 100 yards without slowing for an animal. He drives for miles now. His team finds nothing. No movement. No eyes in the headlights. Just road and sawgrass and engine noise in a silence that has no right to exist there. He described stopping at a specific spot on a specific road where he had once photographed 53 individual mammals in a 2-hour window. He pulled over. He stepped out of the truck. He stood in the dark and listened for what he knew used to be there. Nothing. Not reduced, not quieter. Nothing. The spot that had held 53 animals in 2 hours now held only the sound of the engine cooling. The implications extend far beyond heartbreak. The Everglades provides flood protection and water filtration for millions of people. It recharges drinking water aquifers for one of the fastest-growing regions in the country. Ecologists estimate its annual economic value at more than $31 billion. The small mammals the pythons ate were not peripheral to that system. They were the foundation of it. The pythons were not just eating animals. They were dismantling a machine. Hunting ghosts. Florida's response began with the Florida Python Challenge, a public hunting competition. In its 2024 iteration, participants removed 195 pythons. If the population is 300,000, that is 0.065%. A single breeding aggregation replaces every snake the challenge removes. It is awareness, not a solution, not even a dent. So the state hired full-time professional contractors under the Python Action Team removing invasive constrictors, known as Patrick, launched in 2017. Donna Khalil became one of its most recognized hunters. She described the work, sweeping a headlamp across the berm at night, finding nothing, and then something registers at the edge of your vision. A shadow that does not match the vegetation. And then it resolves. A body the diameter of a telephone pole coiled so still it looked like a root. She called it hunting ghosts. Since 2017, Patrick contractors have removed more than 23,000 Burmese pythons from Florida. 23,000 animals. And that number likely represents less than 5% of the total population. The pipeline constantly refills. Every available technology has been tested and found inadequate. Thermal drones cannot detect cold-blooded snakes that match ambient temperature. Robotic prey decoys were ignored. Pythons are ambush predators that simply wait for real prey. The one approach showing genuine results is the Judas Snake program. Researchers surgically implant a GPS tracker in a sexually mature male, release him, and follow him directly to a breeding aggregation during mating season. Ian Bartosek of the Conservancy of Southwest Florida pioneered this technique and used it to locate and remove some of the largest breeding females ever recorded in the wild, including a female weighing 215 pounds captured in 2024, the heaviest Burmese python ever documented in Florida. But the spatial scale of the Everglades makes meaningful coverage impossible with this method alone, and veteran hunters began saying something difficult to dismiss. Mike Kimmel, known as Python Cowboy, said, "These animals are learning. The snakes are withdrawing into deep sawgrass and cypress hammocks where no human presence is consistent. The breeding populations are concentrating in the areas hardest to reach." He said they are adapting to us faster than we are adapting to them. But in 2025, something shifted the equation. Florida Fish and Wildlife partnered with a Miami-based company called Inversa to integrate real-time hunter GPS positioning, python detection reports, and movement pattern analysis, directing hunters to the highest probability locations hour by hour. The system does not wait for a hunter to stumble across a python in the dark. It tells the hunter where the python most likely is before the hunter leaves the truck. In just 3 months, from May through July 2025, the Patrick program removed 1,022 pythons. The entire previous year's total was 748. In July 2025 alone, more pythons were removed than in all of 2024 combined. The program achieved its 2-year objectives 18 months ahead of schedule. FWC management workload dropped 89%. Hunter pay increased 60%. The state also expanded access to an additional 135,000 acres of state park land and secured increased access to federal lands inside Big Cypress National Preserve, directly targeting the deep interior zones where the breeding populations had been retreating. Python Cowboy said the snakes were adapting by going deeper. Florida responded by following them in. The invisible plague. But what if the most dangerous thing in Florida's swamp was not the 20-foot constrictor? What if the invasion had a second wave, already years ahead of anywhere anyone knew to look? Dr. Terrence Farrell, a herpetologist at Stetson University, was conducting routine health screenings on wild-caught animals when he noticed something wrong. Not with the pythons, with the native snakes. Garter snakes, pygmy rattlesnakes, eastern diamondbacks, showing up emaciated, lethargic, mouths hanging open in respiratory distress. When his team performed necropsies, they found the lungs packed. Dozens of small, pale, translucent organisms, visibly alive, visibly motile, tangled in dense masses inside the respiratory passages of animals slowly suffocating. In snakes still alive during examination, the organisms were extruding from open mouths too weak to close. The organism is Rhyliatiella orientalis, the snake lungworm, and it arrived in Florida inside the Burmese pythons. The lungworm and the Burmese python share millions of years of coevolutionary history. In Southeast Asia, the python's immune system manages the parasite load without serious clinical effects. It is a carrier. Florida's native snakes have never encountered this organism. Their immune systems have no template for it. Farrell described it as the first contact between European explorers and isolated indigenous populations. One group developed resistance across generations. The other has none. The results are catastrophic. The transmission pathway makes it nearly impossible to contain. An infected python deposits waste containing microscopic larvae. Cockroaches, ubiquitous throughout the Everglades, consume the waste and pick up the larvae. A native frog eats the cockroach. A native snake eats the frog. This is not aberrant behavior. This is how the system has always worked. Except now, the frog is carrying a death sentence. Once inside the snake, the larvae bore through the stomach wall, migrate to the respiratory system, and anchor in the lungs. They feed, grow, and reproduce. Over weeks or months, the airways fill. The snake weakens progressively. Eventually, it suffocates. Farrell described it as drowning in slow motion. Dr. Melissa Miller, a parasitologist at the University of Florida, established the full extent. At minimum, 18 distinct native snake species have been confirmed infected. The geographic distribution extends as far north as Jacksonville, hundreds of miles from the Everglades. And then came the finding that Miller said made her go cold. The lungworm no longer needs the python. The parasite has completed a host shift. It has established a self-sustaining transmission cycle operating entirely through the native snake community without any Burmese python involvement. Even if every single python in Florida were somehow removed overnight, the lungworm would remain. It is in the cockroaches. It is in the frogs. It is cycling through the ecosystem on its own terms. The plague is self-sustaining. Florida now faces catastrophe on two simultaneous fronts. The pythons consuming the mammal community from above. The lungworm destroys the native reptile community from below. The Everglades being demolished from the roofline and the foundation at exactly the same time. But buried inside the horror of the survey data, researchers found one anomaly. The Florida cottonmouth appears to be resistant to the lungworm. Farrell's team examined cottonmouths in areas of confirmed heavy infection and found almost nothing. Parasite loads so low as to be functionally insignificant. Nobody can explain it yet. But somewhere in the biology of this one resistant species, there may be information that could eventually protect others. That anomaly is now one of the most actively studied questions in Everglades research. USGS scientists are also developing genetic biocontrol tools aimed at disrupting the reproductive cycle of pythons at the population level, targeting only the invasive species without affecting native wildlife. Eradication is not a realistic near-term goal, but suppression at scale for the first time is beginning to look like something other than a fantasy. The Emperor returns. Florida Fish and Wildlife's next announcement caused immediate outrage. They were releasing hundreds of snakes into the wild on purpose. The people reacting had not read past the first sentence. The snake being released was the eastern indigo, not an invader. The exact opposite. A species native to the southeastern United States, once abundant across Florida, driven to functional extinction by habitat loss, and absent from key ecosystems for more than 50 years. The longest native snake in North America. Scales so deeply black they refract into blue-green iridescence in direct sunlight. The word researchers and wildlife photographers most commonly use when they encounter one in the field is not impressive or striking. The word they use is beautiful, but the eastern indigo's beauty is incidental to its ecological significance. What matters is what it eats. The eastern indigo is an ophiophage, a snake-eater, completely immune to the venom of every pit viper in North America. Rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, copperheads. The indigo overpowers them with jaw strength and body mass and swallows them head first while they are still fighting. Dr. Dirk Stevenson of the Orion Society calls it the emperor of the forest floor. At the ground level of the southeastern forest, nothing challenges an adult eastern indigo, but the emperor had been displaced. The eastern indigo depends on gopher tortoise burrows for shelter. When Florida's development boom converted native longleaf pine flatwoods into residential and agricultural land, tortoise populations declined, and the indigos declined with them. By 1978, the eastern indigo was functionally gone from North Florida. The Orion Society began a captive breeding program and spent years reconstructing longleaf pine ecosystems in the Florida Panhandle. Not just planting trees, but rebuilding the full community of species a functioning longleaf flatwood requires. The gopher tortoise colonies that would provide the burrow networks the indigos need. When the habitat was ready, they began releasing captive-bred eastern indigos into the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve. Then, in late 2023, a trail camera at the entrance to a gopher tortoise burrow captured footage that made Dirk Stevenson watch it 11 times before he let himself believe what he was seeing. 2 eastern indigo hatchlings, not released animals. Born in the wild, conceived in the wild, hatched in the wild without any human assistance. No longer than a pencil, moving with the unhurried confidence of an animal with no reasonable predators. For the first time in more than 50 years, eastern indigo snakes were reproducing autonomously in North Florida. The emperor was not just returning. The emperor was rebuilding its dynasty. The collision course. Go back to Dr. Kirkland's trail camera, the footage that made him call his team that night. A bobcat, 25 pounds, dragging the decapitated body of a 50-pound Burmese python through the mud. The head was gone. Targeted first, neutralized, the rest of the snake killed after. The bobcat was claiming the carcass. For 20 years, the Burmese python had existed in the Everglades as an apex predator with no serious challengers. Not because native predators could not theoretically pose a threat, but because they had no learned experience with this specific animal. That was changing. Alligators were being documented ambushing smaller pythons. Trail cameras from Everglades National Park captured a Florida panther, one of fewer than 200 remaining in the wild, stalking a python for 20 minutes through a palmetto thicket before making a final approach and strike. Ian Easterling, a National Park Service wildlife technician, told colleagues that the native predators were doing something nobody's models had predicted, and they were learning. A python digesting a large meal is sluggish and vulnerable. A python in cooler temperatures is metabolically suppressed. A python's head is proportionally fragile to a predator that strikes fast enough to end the fight before it begins. For the first time in 20 years, the pythons were taking losses, and the eastern indigos are moving south toward the ecosystem that needs them most. A juvenile Burmese python 3 or 4 feet long falls within the size range an eastern indigo can overpower. For a small python, the indigo almost certainly wins. A mature 15-foot female that weighs 150 to 200 pounds is a different equation. Stevenson has been asked about that encounter in multiple interviews. His answer stays consistent. He says he honestly does not know. Nobody knows. Nobody has observed that encounter in the wild. But there is a genuine possibility that the eastern indigo could exert meaningful predation pressure on the juvenile python population. Every juvenile that does not survive to adulthood is a reproductive failure for the invasion. Hanging over all of it is the question Farrell calls the thing that frightens him most. Not the pythons, the lungworm. Can Raeliatiella orientalis infect an eastern indigo snake? The indigo's venom immunity is tied to specific molecular features of its blood chemistry. There is no reason to assume that immunity extends to a parasitic nematode with a completely different biological profile. If the lungworm reaches eastern indigo populations before they achieve self-sustaining densities, it could eliminate the emperor before the emperor can accomplish what everyone needs it to accomplish. It could kill the restoration. Dr. Kirkland kept a copy of the memory card. Sometimes, when the work felt particularly heavy, he would watch the 6 weeks of footage compress into a single session. The stillness. Nights when nothing moved through the frame at all. The silence Mazzotti had described, now captured in unmoving, unbothered darkness. What began as a handful of released and escaped Burmese pythons has become one of the largest invasive predator crises in modern history. The pythons are still spreading. The lungworm is self-sustaining and moving north. The eastern indigo restoration is still in its early chapters. The hunters are removing more snakes than at any point in history, and it is still not enough on its own. But something is different now from what it was 5 years ago. The native predators are learning to identify and exploit python vulnerabilities that no model anticipated. The indigo is rebuilding its dynasty and habitat that was rebuilt specifically to receive it. And somewhere in the biology of the cottonmouth, the one species showing unexplained resistance to the lungworm, there may be information that could eventually protect everything else. The Everglades is not recovering, but for the first time in 2 decades it is fighting back on multiple fronts simultaneously.